I'd like to call this meeting to order. Today is Monday, January 13th, 2014. We're meeting for the purposes of the Committee of the Whole. I would ask that you all rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Clerk Spencer, please call the roll.
Gutenkopf. Absent. Deuter. Here. Dunn.
Here.
Leader.
Here.
Polemski. Absent. Bram.
Here.
Hipskin.
Here.
York.
Here.
Levin. Absent. Healy.
Here.
Honquist.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
Mulliner. He's absent. Wagner.
Here.
10 present, 4 absent.
10 present, 4 absent. We have a quorum.
I didn't know they were still in committee.
They were wrapping up the last item.
Mr. Trezine, could you let the committee know downstairs that we've called the meeting to order? Well, we do have a quorum. I didn't realize the committee was still meeting, but,
They're at different times.
oh, there, well, that's one of them.
No, that's not one.
Yeah.
Okay, agenda item number 2, announcements. Are there any announcements? Alderman Dunn.
Yes, hang on a second.
Oh, yeah, okay. Alderman Dunn?
Yes, bear with me, I had to look this up. I just want to announce this Saturday, the 18th, at Mary Queen of Heaven Church, there will be another electronic recycling event. I know we've had quite a few of those in town. That's good to see. There's a lot of opportunities to recycle these types of goods. Again, this is Saturday, the 18th, from 9 to 2 at Mary Queen of Heaven Church in Elmhurst.
Okay, very good.
Can you repeat that time again? The screen was going down right at the time.
10 to 2.
Mr. Dunn.
9 o'clock to 2, 9 a.m. to 2 p.m. on this Saturday, the 18th of
Okay,
January.
great. Any other announcements? Alderman Bram.
Thank you. Yes, last week we announced that the Third Ward Town Hall would be upcoming. We are adjusting the date to the end of January, being January 29th, instead of, I think it was either this week or the following week. So January 29th is the new Third Ward Town Hall meeting, Wednesday, 7 o'clock at the Elmhurst Public Library.
Okay. Any additional announcements this evening? Oh, yeah, I guess I have one. Next Monday is Martin Luther King Day, so our regularly scheduled council meeting is moved to Tuesday. Okay? Same time, but different date. Sorry, Mr. Levin. Are you making a presentation? Come on in. That's it for announcements. Public comments. Clerk Spencer, is there anybody who has signed up for public comment this evening?
No one signed in.
No one has signed up for public comment. Is there anyone in the audience at this time who did not have an opportunity to sign up on our sign-in sheet but would wish to address the council on any matter? Seeing none, we'll move on. Business before the committee. Agenda item number 4, financial analysis of the Hahn Street development, finalist proposal. Before I ask Mr. Kopp and Mr. Richlicki to jump in, let me just set the stage a little bit. What was it? Was it the 9th? When was our last meeting? December 9th. We met as a committee before Christmas, and we had a pretty good discussion and a whole lot of conversation and question that we had, both of Mr. Richlicki and city staff, and we actually asked them to pull together some numbers in some sort of a format where we can compare apples to apples when possible and apples to oranges when not possible. And that is where we are this evening. It is my hope that, I don't expect it this evening, let me look at my calendar. It's my hope that we'll have a conversation tonight. Any additional questions or conversations will be asked, and I am suggesting to the council that we have another committee of the whole meeting January 27th, 2 weeks from tonight, another committee night. And I would say that would be our target, to entertain a motion and move forward from a negotiation standpoint with one of the two developers. I've had an opportunity to talk to a handful of aldermen, and I got all positive responses. Is that something we think we can do?
Yeah.
I think 2 weeks, it gives not only additional time for city staff to get any information that's needed tonight, but provide that information over the next 2 weeks to the council, so that I think we're in a position now as well where we have as much information as I think we're going to get before we take it to the finalist level. And that's the other thing I wanted to point out before we get started. It's also my recommendation to the council, and I talked to the city manager about this as well. Our RFP on page 19 says that ultimately our end goal is for the mayor and the city council to choose an applicant and authorize the city to negotiate. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a 100% approval to move forward with that developer, but certainly that would be the lead person or lead developer. But really what we're doing is we're getting to the council authorizing the city to negotiate with one developer or the other. So that's my hope, that we'll get to that at the end of the meeting on the 27th, at the conclusion of the meeting on the 27th. The last thing I will bring up is that we have what I'll call a maybe sophisticated and complicated ranking system that the council designed, which I think is a good reference to understand the priorities that the council set for this project. However, I don't think that it makes any sense to ask the council to go through that same ranking process when we only have two finalists. I really think it's going to be, you're either going to vote for one or you're going to vote for the other. So I'm hoping the council will agree with me that our vote 2 weeks from now is just going to be, someone's going to make a motion for one of the two developers. That'll either pass or it's not going to pass, and then someone will make a motion for the other developer. Does that sound good? I do think that it is a good indication, this ranking process, of what was the priorities of the council, and something to consider in your decision-making. But so what I'm seeing is nodding of the heads. We won't be doing, asking council to submit a full ranking process on this, since you're just going to pick one or the other. Okay? Does that sound pretty good? Any other comments, Mr. Grabowski, or are we ready for? Okay, Mr. Kopp, I'll turn it over to you. I know you have the, and Mr. Rich Licky have put together a proposal, and also we have the couple of the charts that you've provided separately.
Correct, thank you. As you recall, in the December 9th meeting, we presented the Kane McKenna report and the different financial findings that they had developed. And we thought we could do a little better, closer comparison to an apple-apples comparison if we had one more chance to discuss with the developers the numbers they presented. We met with both developers the week prior to Christmas, and I think we did get some good information out of both of them. We had a memo delivered to you on Thursday that explains the findings of the meeting we had. I think at this point, I would just like to turn it over to Mr. Rich Licky to go through just a short presentation, sort of explaining where we are with these are preliminary numbers, where we're at those numbers, and then he can answer any questions specific to the numbers that were presented. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Rich Licky.
Okay. I don't have an alderman specifically to ask this question.
Thank you, Mike.
I mean, if we stick with these dates, it's about $1 million in taxes. It's real.
And we asked him that. Of course, I said we'll just agree everything.
While we're trying to figure this out, I just want to point out, to echo a little bit of what Mike said, in terms of, why we needed a little extra time, and also put a disclaimer in there as it relates to our reporting back to the city council. The numbers, even though we've had a chance to get some clarification, thanks, Mike. even though we've had a chance to get some clarification as it relates to those numbers, I just want to point out, similar to what we did on, or pointed out on December 9th, you know, these are best guess estimates from the developers based on the information they've had. There has not been any final drawings or specs that have allowed them to fine-tune this a little more. I mean, I think, again, both parties have worked forward with the city in good faith. They've responded to some of the questions and clarification requirements that we had. And, you know, we are where we are today as a follow-up to that. But I would, again, just point out that these numbers are likely to change again in the future. I mean, at some point, in order to induce, you know, each party to go forward, or one party to go forward, there has to be some expectation from their end as it relates to control of the property and the ability then to work with financing sources in order for them to secure at least the intent of financing and allow them to spend additional dollars as it relates to some of fine-tuning these numbers. With that being said, with respect to Lincoln, again, there's some of the basic parameters. Those haven't changed as it relates to the amount of units, the number of spaces, and the retail space that's been proposed. We put together a memo. I think there was 8 or 9 different follow-up items that we had in which we were trying to determine where costs were included in some of the gross line items or whether those costs had been included. And those amounts are summarized in our memo. I mean, essentially, we did confirm that the streetscape was a lower number than we had anticipated. Lincoln had indicated that they were going to bump that up somewhat. Even based on that increase, we made our own adjustments in Exhibit A of our memo that identified that we thought maybe those numbers still should be a little larger, and that was included because, again, the city had, similar to the utilities relocation, had a better handle on what the streetscape would be in the city's downtown and extending that over to this project. The hard construction cost numbers, which was a number of questions we had as to what was packed in there, we're able to identify that, yes, general conditions, contingency were included in there, as well as some other numbers relating to some site work, and that was clarified accordingly. Issues or questions that we had regarding the fees, both construction management and development fee were confirmed, and amounts as it related to the financing structure and what was included in that were also confirmed, as well as the amounts that they had proposed to pay for impact fees. Again, in an Exhibit A, what we did was identify those costs, made modifications to the budget, and then, you know, from a big picture standpoint, what we saw was the TIF assistance number increased slightly from $1.4 million to about $1.7 million, and also the total budget, again, because we included city costs that they had not included, had also increased as well. On the morning side numbers, again, we had similar questions as it related to classification or clarification as it related to where certain costs were included. And a number of things came out on this project a little differently as they did to Lincoln. We did see a downward adjustment in the project costs. A big part of that primarily related to a change in the financing structure, indicating less of a use for the mezzanine financing, which had higher interest component or accrued interest over that part of the project financing, and that resulted in a differential of close to $3 million. And then there were some other amounts, again, similar to what we did for Lincoln as it related to utilities relocation, lease termination. A number of other amounts were also identified and clarified from those meetings. Net impact was, again, the project budget overall was reduced, and we also saw a differential as it related to the TIF assistance request with implied costs and their costs. went down from around 4.4 million to 3.6 million. As I stated overall, the costs here are still preliminary. I think what was important to us as we went through this was to basically get some clarification as it primarily related to some of the bigger ticket items, and try to compare, as Mike indicated, a little apples to apples. When we made those changes in terms of the comparison of the project revenues to the costs, both direct costs of the developer and some of the other costs that we identified for the city, the financing picture started to narrow a little bit in terms of the net revenues produced by Lincoln were in the amount of 10.4, rounded, and the amounts as it related to Morningside increased to 7.1. So we started to see a little bit more of those costs starting to come together. I know there were also some questions as it related to the additional property costs as it related to some of the Hahn property. We identified what that amount is in terms of the, review by the city council. That amount, I think, was $7 million. But again, that was, in our opinion, a cost of TIF 1. I mean, again, it's something for you to consider. I mean, we're not making policy here. We're just, in terms of the TIF 4 comparison, though, in order to make that apples to apples, we really, in terms of that net 10 million or that net 7 million, we really looked at only the TIF 4 revenues as it related to what the current or projected TIF 4 costs were. The mayor indicated in terms of the process where the city would be moving next. I think part and parcel of the selection process would involve, once one developer is chosen, working on refining some of those numbers. The TIF projections or the TIF revenues, as we see it, is part of the decision by the city. I mean, it includes other things as it relates to your assessment of the developer capacity, the assessment of what kind of design, what kind of project overall would be part of the downtown in that area, as well as what the projected return could be. Big picture, again, one of the things, as we noticed this, and again, we're more numbers people, not design or aesthetics, but given, that both projects were fairly close as it related to the amount of residential units, the amount of parking, and the amount of retail space. I mean, differential of maybe 9 units as it relates to the apartments and about 2,000 or 3,000 feet on the retail. There is a differential, though, as it relates to, as you could see, the amount of revenue to be received by the city, and in part, that's also translated to some of the differences we see in cost. I mean, overall, the Lincoln project, about 49 million in terms of total cost, the Morningside at about 54 million. And the main drivers in terms of that differential relate to construction cost. There's about a $2.7 million differential on cost, site preparation, about 900,000, and then the residual fees, primarily developer fee, where you have another $1.5 million, $1.6 million. So those are the primary differences as we see related to each of the projects. But again, that's not the whole story. I mean, in part, it identifies some of the need as it relates to why the TIF request could be bigger or larger on the Morningside, again, given requirements for return. As costs go up, return goes down. In order to offset that, you're going to require additional amount of incentive. So, but again, as we said, that's part of the that's part of your overall review process, which would include other factors. One of the questions that came up at the last meeting to us was, well, okay, I think it was you, Alderman, in terms of what happens if you pick one horse, so to speak. Where do we go forward, and how committed are we? One of the things that we've advocated, in terms not only with Elmhurst but in other clients that we've worked with, that if you do make a selection, it's important, we think, to identify some conditions precedent, whether it relates to performance benchmarks, what's a timeline for when certain things have to be submitted or what are goals to be achieved, and when they have to be achieved. What kind of financing, and do they have evidence of the financing? Because that's a big part of this as it relates to the ability to deliver the product that you think you should get and that they've promised to you is going to be premised in part upon, can they get the financing in order to get that done? And lastly, because, and we beat this horse to death, as it relates to, because a lot of these numbers are preliminary, it's good to have a safety valve. And one of the things that we've looked at, and I think the city has had on other projects, is the ability to look back and recalibrate or measure the project if things change in the future. So you'd want access to their financials for what they call the open book to determine if, let's say, the project budget of $50 million was achieved. If not, if there were savings that had occurred, there should be some ability to recalibrate the incentive and mark that down accordingly. Same with returns. Various representations have been made to the city and to the consultants as it relates to why this assistance is needed, why it's going to help the project out. And part of that is tied into market returns that are required for a project. Well, to the extent that part of the incentive here is the land at a reduced cost or at costs that are less than what the city had paid for originally, the idea would be if the project does better, there should be some way to recoup or get a return of some of those profits or excess profits that would help offset some of the city's initial investment in addition to the TIF or the sales tax revenues. So again, we just want to point out that from the standpoint of moving forward, you are required, or as you go forward by your rules in terms of making a decision, not every I will be dotted, not every T will be crossed. But again, I want to point out, at this stage of the process, that's normal. I think you work forward to identify what your criteria are in terms of what the selection is, and move forward with the idea that you're going to have some protections as it relates to you're not going to transfer the property but for A, B, or C. And once you do, or if you intend to make that transfer, there are going to be safety valves or requirements that the developer has to meet if the project changes or improves over the future, again, given the fact that the city is not recouping all its dollars initially.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Richlicki. Is there anybody at this time who has any questions with regard to either the presentation we're given here or the additional information that was provided in the January 9th memo? Alderman York.
Thank you, Your Honor. On Exhibit C, the basis for that exhibit, is that 20-year net present value, or that's not indicated anywhere?
These are gross numbers. These are cumulative gross dollars over time.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Kopp or Mr. Richlicki, I think we're going to, I think the PowerPoint presentation was a good summary, but I think that there's going to be some specific questions regarding Exhibit A, B, and C on the memo. So I think it would be helpful if we had access to those or are prepared to pull those up when necessary. I know they're on board docs. So that some of the summaries that Mr. Richlicki talked about are specifically there, and I think that will help when we answer these questions. Mr. York, do you want to put up C, just so that everybody on the council and the audience knows the question Mr. York had, and then we can switch between them. Mr. York, which numbers, though, were you?
I just wanted to know what the whole chart was based on, because we'd seen some net present value comparisons earlier. And so if this is gross dollars, I get it, I understand.
It's from these numbers as it relates to both the TIF revenues and the sales tax revenues and the amounts identified for the school are from our last report. And there were actually two charts in that report. One had the net present value review, and then the one right after it had the gross or the cumulative dollars. So these numbers came from that report as it relates to the tax revenues. The numbers underneath
expenditures.
in terms of the estimated expenditures, some of those were in that report, and some other ones were added based on the clarification points that we had after the December 9th meeting. So there's a little bit of a mix and match, for example, on Lincoln as it relates to the streetscape number. That number was increased. If you go over on the right side to the Morningside concept, you could see the TIF incentive went down from 3,300,000 to 2,470,000. So there were adjustments underneath.
Okay, Alderman Healy, then Alderman Bram.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Same exhibit, same line of question. Can you, and I know it was in a previous document, can you refresh my memory as to the length of time, the cumulative sales tax, and the TIF gross revenues, which I assume are property taxes? What length of time is that for?
Those are over the 23-year period of the TIF district. So the district was set up last year in 13? So we're having it basically in 2036 with a final payment in 2037.
Okay, so those sales taxes are over that 23 years?
Right, and if you look at the numbers, you'll see like in the first 4 or 5 years, the amounts are minimal, due in part to the construction and to the buildup of the residential project. So there's 3 or 4 years very lean, and then the remaining 19 years, we basically see more growth.
Thank you.
Just one point of clarification. We actually approved the TIF in 2012. Our intergovernmental agreement was done in 2013. I don't think it is relevant, but that's still the same numbers we're talking about. Alderman Bram.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Mayor, you already covered one question if this presentation was going to be online, so thank you for that. My questions go back to last week, I believe, whenever the last time was when we spoke about this. The Exhibit A and Exhibit B, the TIF incentive, it says requested, it's in red typeface, requested implied TIF incentive, and it's 1.7 plus for Lincoln and 3.6, I think, for Morningside. Does that include any of the land acquisition that the city's already done, the 1.8 for the Pauley property, or the 7 million plus for the rest of the properties?
No, it does not. Those numbers are independent of the land cost for both the Pauley property as well as the previous TIF 1 acquisitions.
Okay. And if you could explain Exhibit C, I know we've had a couple email exchanges on this offline. I'm not understanding well, I guess to a certain degree I understand the value of the TIF 4 projections, but this also impacted TIF 1 greatly. How does that come into play or calculation when we're looking at a project here versus looking at TIF analysis? I know TIF analysis is a part of the project, but essentially we're looking at what's the best project for the city of Elmhurst as a whole, being total cost to the city of Elmhurst residents and the total benefits or return on investment on either of these projects.
That's outside of
Well, the only thing I could do to try to answer that is to give a couple examples. And it's particularly as it relates to some other towns we work with where they had parking. And from a standpoint of the utilization of TIF, it wasn't as, return was important, but it wasn't the only factor. Part of it had to do with keeping people in the downtown, convenient parking, channeling direction in a certain area of the downtown. So when I said that there's other variables, what I was trying to point out is from a standpoint of each project, depending on the policy requirements, depending on, the city's plans for that area, TIF is part of it. It could either be a tool to induce that development to go forward, or it could be a method to allow you to improve or increase your return because there are additional taxes that come in. I guess the way we look at it, or the way we've seen it with other towns, is TIF and revenue generation it doesn't have to be the entire story. That's all I was trying to say.
Okay. Back to the two exhibits of B and A and B. So if roughly here, the 3.6 million that is stated for the incentive, the TIF incentive for Morningside, if we were talking total incentives, would I add to that figure 8 million plus because of all the land acquisition? So it would be closer to 12 million total?
Again, you know, the way we looked at it, and part of this had to do with, again, just our orientation. You know, we're TIF guys, as it related to when the costs were incurred and how the costs are allocated. You know, we looked at it separately from a TIF 4, TIF 1. Obviously, we put that number in a footnote in the event, you know, different aldermen wanted to make that cost comparison for themselves. That's there for you to look at. But I just want to point out, as we analyzed it, given the different time periods involved, given the different revenue sources potentially that would be utilized for recoupment, our orientation was to split those two numbers between direct TIF 4 and direct TIF 4 revenues. But again, you know, from a standpoint of how you want to look at it, I've learned my lesson many years ago. There's different ways to skin a cat.
Okay, I understand. I just want to make sure that the public is aware of, when looking at these slides, that the total cost is different than what's being reflected here. And the last question, and this might be for the city manager, in these comparisons, it's showing Morningside against Lincoln as a 6-story proposal. I thought the last that we saw was a 4 and a 6, the last materials that we received. Does that mean that Morningside withdrew their 4-story proposal and they're only going with the 6 moving forward? Or is this just to try to do apples to apples and 4 stories is still on the table?
That's correct. The last part of your statement is correct. This was to do the apples to apples. The 4-story is still on the table. As far as Morningside has not withdrawn that.
Thank you.
And one correction, the Lincoln proposal is 5-story and the Morningside is 6-story. But again, just to make the apples to apples number of units comparison, we did it this way.
Okay. Thank you.
Alderman Dunn.
Yes, my question is regarding the schedule of the projects, and I was wondering if there was any validation of the proposed schedules. The Morningside timeline is to be completed in July of 2015, and I think they gave that date for both the 4 and the 6-story concepts, whereas the Lincoln proposal was October of 2016, significantly later. Was the schedule looked at at all?
It was discussed with each of the entities, and it was noted in terms of confirmation of both those times.
How is the Lincoln, or how is the Morningside occupancy, first occupancy, so much shorter? And it's the similar size structure, one floor higher.
My guess would be, and again, we did not ask that direct question as it related to the differential. It was more on the confirmation. It could be in part due to the way each group stages the projects, giving themselves appropriate amounts of maybe to be safer in terms of that differential between Lincoln and Morningside. But specifically, we did not get information as it relates to why. They confirmed how those, where the dates were. We pointed out where the differential was, and that's about as far as we got.
Alderman Gutenkopf.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So if we're still supposed to be considering or potentially considering a 4-story Morningside project, but we don't have a financial analysis of that project as it compares with these other options, how were you anticipating us to consider that? We've done the financial analysis of Morningside 6-story as it relates to Lincoln, but we not done exactly the same thing for the 4-story project?
Let me ask Mr. Schlicke. At one point, we had broken out the 4-story
It's in the initial, right, it's in
Thank
the
you.
initial report. I think, partly from the follow-up standpoint, we were looking at, as Jim mentioned, the apples-to-apples thing where where we were gonna go after some of these clarification points. Given the size of the projects, it seemed that we thought we would either come closer, trying to bring them closer together, or identify or what we thought some of the points of difference were. And I think the other point, if I remember correctly, I mean, the four-story return numbers were fairly dramatic the other way as it related to the amount of assistance that was required. But it's, again, I would have to say, now that I said that, it was still on a table, but it wasn't one of the elements that we went back for the follow-through. I mean, in the absence of that, we still have the numbers that we have from their original proposal, though.
So,
Alderman Gutenkopf, certainly we can have another schedule prepared 2 weeks from now and probably get one even sooner out to the council and on board docs that can add that column for the four-story. I think the general feeling, my opinion, and city manager did talk to me about, I did ask about this similar question when I saw this, is that the feeling was the choice was really between these two types of projects. If the choice is the four-story project, it's a drastically different choice. So, but to answer your question, I think, I'm not saying they can do it very easily, but certainly I think that Kane McKenna and city staff can pull together what I would consider a third column on this Exhibit C to help city council make that decision.
follow-up?
Yes.
I think that's going to be an important component of the discussion because we as a council have not rejected the idea of building something that falls within our code. I think going above 4 stories is a whole, different kind of a discussion. And if the follow-up questions from Ken McKenna didn't include the 4-story, don't the dollars change based on the results of some of the follow-up questions? And so I do think that even if it's the preliminary discussion that we have about which project we would like to move forward on, I think that's going to be an important opportunity for the council to make that decision about height overall and not to make the assumption that just because the 5- and 6-story are more comparable that the 4-story is completely off the table. I mean, it's a completely different kind of a discussion.
No, point well taken. I think city staff, there was not the intent of city staff to take that off the table. And I think the conversation we had on the 27th, the memo we got on the 27th, had most of those numbers in there for the 4-story, so we
No, we
can,
had it there, we can update that.
we can
That's-
certainly
that's,
update it.
Be
that's an
helpful.
easy-
Update it for full
Okay.
consideration.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's an easy one.
Okay. Alderman Deuter.
Thank you, Mayor. The Exhibit A and Exhibit B both have a line that says, it's called land entitlement costs. What's included in land entitlement costs?
The preliminary costs associated with any legal and planning review as it relates to getting them to zoning.
Alderman Deuter, what line item are we on up there?
It is in both exhibits. It's at the very top under
Oh, got
land
it.
costs.
Second from the top, okay.
Yeah, second line from the top.
Go ahead, follow up. Alderman
Just the
Deuter.
follow-up is, for that line, Lincoln has a 0 or does not have a number there, and Morningside's is 150,000. Do you have a sense of, is this a necessary cost, and if so, what the appropriate number is?
Yeah, I think from the standpoint as it relates to Lincoln, some of those costs are going to be included in the architect and engineering costs, some of the legal. It could just be, it was, the way I looked at it was more like categorization. They broke that out as it related to putting that in with the land cost. Again, it could be part of their format as it relates to presentation to their financing sources. And Lincoln, they both have to do the same thing. It's just a question of where they put it.
Showed it. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Alderman Deuter, and then Alderman Levin.
Thank you, Mayor. Just one additional question. Lincoln has a request of $200 per space per year for the structured public parking. I don't know if you could weigh in, or if someone from the city could weigh in to say, is that kind of the way the city typically budgets maintenance for structured parking? Is that a reasonable cost of structured
I
parking?
think that's still an open issue. I think as it relates to how that parking would be structured and what it is that the city would be expecting back in return. I think that's one of the elements as it relates to some of those conditions precedent, or where we have to sharpen a pencil a little bit.
Alderman Levin.
Thank you. A couple things. First one is, if I understand this correctly in terms of the process, these numbers are proposed, and if I understand how things would normally go, we would select one of the respondents, and then we are actually negotiating. So the numbers can change greatly, is that correct?
They can change, yes.
And there was a lot of financial analysis, and I read through, I'm not as expert, obviously, as you, or we wouldn't have to hire you, but since you read it.
We appreciate the work.
Thank you. Can you comment on your feeling of the level of detail in terms of the financial analysis between the two proposals?
Sure. From the standpoint, let me just, I guess, get the question clear. From a financial analysis, are you asking about when we looked at their, projected revenues and their financing proposal and what their returns were? If that's the question, both, let's go to the top end of the financial model, which is what are the revenues? Both sides were fairly close. I think they had some of the same comparables as it related to the marketplace. They looked at the kind of product that they thought would be needed in order to attract that kind of rent. There was some differentials as it related to some trending going out, to when the project was completed. I think Morningside had trended some of the rents out, Lincoln didn't. But their baselines were fairly close. The other variable then is, relates to, their costs, because in order to get a financeable project, in our opinion, there's a threshold level, return on cost, and then once you get past that, you'll look at how the various components, whether the debt or the equity, is there enough revenue for them to be repaid? Both proposals were in the mid-sixes, 6.5, as it related to return on cost, which is pretty much, I think many lenders would want to see it closer to 7. But again, as I said, these are preliminary numbers. In both developers, it's to be prudent, they're going to be a little high on the costs, just because they haven't completed all the engineering or the final specs. So you would anticipate that the initial return numbers would be on the lower side of what's required, with the end game being improvement of those numbers as costs and engineering or review with contractors proceeds. Again, given the starting point for some of the rents, given where they are on costs, and again, we pointed out, I think, that the main differential between the proposals relates to construction costs and some of the fees. I mean, there was another component as it related to interim carry costs on Morningside, but I think they indicated that they would take a different look at the project as it related to less reliance on mezzanine financing and a financing structure similar to what Lincoln was proposing in terms of 65% debt, 35% equity. Both projects right now pencil out at kind of near the threshold for what's required for lenders or for investors to review the project. But there's still, again, I would indicate that there's still work to be done. I think if the revenues can't be enhanced, then really what they have to do is to take a closer look at their costs, which I think is good for the city. But at this juncture, I think from our standpoint, we thought that the rents were in the market ranges. The cost numbers, we did have questions, and some of it we were able to clarify over the last month. Some is going to just have to wash out as additional refinement comes in. But, we thought that from a return basis, both of these projects at least were near the threshold that's required in the market.
And so when you look at these, is there enough detail so that when you evaluate them, you can tell if the numbers are likely to be locked in or if they're likely to change on one or other of the proposals?
I would categorize our review as more of a sniff test at this point. And I think the answer to your question would be is, I would hope they would be refined, because in particular, I think the cost numbers are something, if the revenues are close to what the market is on a per square foot basis for rents, the idea would be that in order to improve the returns or improve coverage for the lender, they would work harder to improve their cost estimates.
All right, and sort of in a different question, because in an earlier discussion, we had talked about the 4-story versus 6-story Morningside concept, and Lincoln has only the 5. I didn't feel like the 4-story concept really was as viable. From a financial analysis, what's your take on that?
We would concur. We would concur. There were a lot of, I think, in terms of the requirements on the subsidy, there seemed to be, again, there would have to be more work done on the cost side there, because really you only have, when you're looking at projects like this, it's revenues and costs. I mean, you could argue, well, as unleveraged versus leverage, return on cost. There's different ways to slice and dice the project. But at the end of the day, the market is what's important. And I think if the rents are close to what they're forecasting, the only way you're going to improve returns would either be to require more density, which leads to also potentially more costs. So there's only a limited amount of things that can be done to tweak the project on the revenue side. And again, it's either going to be on the per square foot number or more units. I mean, it's just a math problem. On the other side, though, that's where you would hope there would be more give on the numbers, because again, at this time, without knowing exactly the condition of the soils or certain requirements of the materials that have to be engineered, you're better off erring on the higher side, putting in a 10% contingency or an extra $5 a square foot on the numbers, on the construction costs, in order to cover yourself as the project is refined. So I think with the 4-story concept, there's a little less room because you have less revenue. You have less units, you have less revenue, but some of the same cost concerns, because you're talking about parking and underground parking in particular, you got some of the same, you got some of the same cost concerns, but without having the ability to generate more revenue. I mean, that's what it really, I think, boils down to on the 4-story concept.
Does the 4-story concept have a reasonable probability of obtaining financing?
Well, a key for that, if you remember, there was a larger requirement for a TIF incentive on that piece, and there was also no land bid. I think there's if we're going to speak in general terms, yeah, big picture, there might be the ability to get that done, but I think it's going to need more assistance, which proves out in some of the initial numbers that we looked at. The question is how much assistance. I mean, I always go back to my early days learning about public finance. It's, well, can bonds be sold? Well, most of them can. It all depends on the interest rate. So in this case, it would be, what is the ability to increase the return? And if you're constrained by the amount of units that you have, well, then you're going to need more assistance.
I think, and thank you, I mean, I personally, I think we, as a council, ought to be comparing the 6-story and the 5-story concepts, and I think leaving the 4-story concept on the table, which I think has questionable viability is going to confuse the issue, and, I don't know how we move forward on that, but whether it's just expressing my opinion as we get through this meeting and the next one, I'm not, as I said at a previous meeting, I'm not really putting much analysis into the four-story one. I understand that it's going to require some sort of zoning change, but I think for this kind of project, that's what has to be anticipated. There's a certain number of units that have to be achieved before a project like this has financial viability, and I don't think it's there at the 4 stories.
Anyone else who hasn't had an opportunity to speak yet? Alderman Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Going back to Alderman Levin's first question, I'm fairly certain you answered this, but I want to ask it a little more succinctly. So based on your sniff test, using your words of the two proposals, you're fairly confident in the revenue projections, that they're they're within market, both proposals had similar revenue projections,
Right.
Is that correct?
Right.
And that to raise revenue, really you're talking about either adding units or raising rent, and if you're already within market from a rent perspective, all you can do is add units, and that's probably not realistic given a lot of these.
The main issue as it relates, and you're right on both counts, I'm going to agree with both. The issue as it relates to the adding units is parking. I mean, right now is, just talking to city staff as it relates to, and this is not just Elmhurst, but, other downtowns, Naperville, Evanston, other towns we work with. The dilemma as it relates to, and that's why things like TIF, I guess, are, have been utilized over the years. The 3 big issues in most downtowns that we've seen over the years are assembly of property, which is usually very expensive or can be, infrastructure, which usually ties to things like detention, drainage, capacity of older, it's usually where the older stuff is as it relates to mains, and then lastly, parking. Those are 3 big ones. And the market's the market. When you get down to it, it's a little bit of a math problem, because you're going to get rents, $500,000 to $750,000. If interest rates are 5%, that could, and costs are $10 million, you're at break even. If costs are $12 million, back to the drawing board, unless you could get more rents.
So then moving over, and it's true in business, if you can't get more revenue, the only way to become more profitable is cutting cost. It seems like that's the same as what I'm hearing you say, that's kind of the same thing here. Without putting names to either proposal, and I'm hearing you say that when the winner is chosen, they start get going and actually get into the engineering and get into the construction, the costs are going to come down. Most likely they're going to come down based on your experience.
You would hope that.
So
no guarantee, but that's the hope.
What effect for these 2 proposals, if one did a better job of projecting cost than the other, what effect does that have on what I'll call the bottom line, the approximate 3.3 million that separates the 2 from a bottom line perspective? Right. What difference does that have on that bottom line if one did a better job projecting costs than the other?
It's not as much, I think, the difference on the bottom line. It's the difference relates to, one thing would be, in order to improve the bottom line, how much of an incentive it is that you're requiring. And in your example, one possible response could be, well, that's been taken into consideration because we took a harder line on the numbers, and we think that they're going to be higher. If you look at industry averages, that may tell you, again, for purposes of a sniff test, here's where we are. But adding more dollars then could say, well, okay, if it looks like things do increase, you've kind of built that contingency in.
Thank you.
Let me add to the conversation. It's very similar to what Alderman Healy said, but it has to do with I think it was the last page of your presentation, Mr. Rich Licky, where you talk about the conditions precedent. And I just want to rehash a little bit for some of the aldermen that weren't around when the original deal was struck for Hahn Street about 5 or 6 years ago. And I want to stress the open book process and the return on costs. And it directly relates to what Alderman Healy was talking about, is the fact of the matter is that the city is being asked by both developers to participate at a pretty high level, in my opinion. We bought all this land, and we're not getting the same amount of money for the land in either presentation. So there's a high level of participation that the city is already doing. So pick either developer. And I would draw the attention, Mr. Rich Licky also talked about return on costs. And the November 7th memo had a whole bunch of schedules in the back with various return on costs. But let's just say within the negotiation, the city ends up with an 8% return on cost agreement with the developer, or a 7%. For conversation's sake, it doesn't really matter. The fact is, we would try to hold to that line. If somebody came up, if either developer all of a sudden found a windfall within their construction proposal, the price of concrete went through the floor, and all of a sudden it's 50% of what they scheduled. If there's $1 million savings, they don't get that $1 million savings, specifically because we have participated to the tune of millions of dollars on the land. So we will put parameters within the contract that, yes, they need to be as specific as possible, but if there is what I'll call, let's say, excess windfall, regardless of how it comes up, there is mechanisms within the city contract, normally within our contracts like this, that we will participate in that, because we're participating pretty heavily early on. So I just wanted to point out that clarification. It's part of what Mr. Rich Licky had called the conditions of precedent early on. And that was in the original document, and I would fully anticipate the city negotiates that type of protection for the city in whichever developer we move forward with. Okay. Any additional questions or clarifications? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Rich Licky, and city staff, Mr. Kopp, for pulling all this information together. I don't know if I heard many additional questions. There's a specific request to add the fourth story comparison into the additional information for us to consider 2 weeks from now at the committee of the whole that I think we all agreed to. So that is one thing for certain city staff and Mr. Rich Licky we're going to ask you to do. I would also ask any alderman or any elected official who has any additional questions, try to get those questions into city staff as quickly as possible so we can have as much information as possible on the 27th when we're hoping, when we will hold what I hope is the final discussion and potentially move forward and pick someone to negotiate with. Alderman Levin.
For the ease of decision-making and we have a lot to consider for the next meeting, I'm wondering if we can gauge the will of the council to see if we really need to consider that four-story proposal, which to me doesn't seem viable. It's not going to, there's a different economic, there's a difference in the economics right now between a 5 and a 6. I can't even imagine how I would possibly personally look at a four-story component that would make any sense. It seems like it's just going to confuse the process, and I don't know if we can gauge the will of the council with all that we've talked about in terms of seeing whether that's really worth throwing 3 proposals in instead of 2.
Okay, let me see if I can get to that. We've got in the, whatever this memo is, what's the date? The one that was dated January 7th or 9th.
January 9th.
What I see the request from one of the aldermen. We have an Exhibit A, an Exhibit B, and an Exhibit C. And I see what I perceive as the request as the four-story would be to create an Exhibit C that would be a four-story, full-page four-story evaluation. And then the old Exhibit C, which would become Exhibit D, would have a third column on it. That's what I see is being requested. So it's up to the will of the council. I mean, if the information's wanted, great. Is there a way to provide both? I don't know. Alderman Gutenkopf, I mean, you're the one who initially had asked for that additional information. What are your thoughts?
My thought was that the conversation about the four-story option needs to center around, is the council willing to make certain kinds of trade-offs? And until we see it laid out in front of us, I don't know that we can have an effective discussion about whether those trade-offs are something that we're willing to consider. If the trade-off is, a giant financial one for an aesthetic component of what we really want the downtown to look like, because we're not just going to be making our final decision based on the financial analysis. There is an aesthetic and a functional component to the discussion that should be influencing our decision on what we want this project to be. And we've certainly spent enough time asking the developers to present us with their visual picture of what they think this building is going to look like on this property. And I think that before we completely dismiss the four-story option, we need to see the financials, and we need to at least have that in our minds of, how big is this building going to be? What do we want the downtown to look like? How does it fit in? And 6 stories is greatly different from 4 stories. Aesthetically, I want to see the financial laid out, and I don't see that as a huge burden.
Okay. Alderman Brame.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I agree with Alderman Gutenkauf's request. I think since Morningside has not removed that proposal, I think that it behooves us to evaluate that proposal no matter what the dollar amount may or may not say. So I think that the additional time that city staff may put into pulling together those numbers, I think it's worthwhile. If I was told tonight that Morningside withdrew that possibility, then obviously we would just move forward. But it's been from day one, and I think we should evaluate it and do with what you want with the numbers.
Alderman York.
Thank you, Your Honor. I guess a question that I would have would be how much time does city staff estimate it, and with the consultants that it might take to put this analysis together? I mean, I'm looking at a piece of paper here that says one project has a bottom line of $10.5 million, another $7 million, and then you subtract out, for people who want to do that, the $7 million land cost that was in TIF 1 and everything. So we're basically to break even on one project and plus $3 million on another. If we go to all this work, and it's going to show us that we're going to lose $4 million by doing a four-story project, I'm just not sure that the effort is really worth it. Thank you.
Let's get some information from Mr. Kopp and Mr. Richelicky. Basically what the question is, to create what I'll call Exhibit A, in this case, Exhibit A is the Lincoln proposal, to create this for Morningside 4-story and add another column to Exhibit C. How much time?
I don't think it'll take a lot of time. We'll just have to go back to Morningside and verify the numbers, that's all. Just like we did, we met with them a couple weeks ago to verify the 6-story numbers. Well, I mean, I don't think it'd be a lot of time. We have most of the numbers now, it's just a verification.
All right. Alderman Deuter, and then...
Thank you, Mayor. To the extent that we might be focusing in on Morningside's 6-story proposal, I wonder if we could ask Morningside to provide some more drawings of their 6-story proposal. I think the renderings that they submitted as the second part of their proposal, unless I missed them, I think all they gave were the 4-story renderings. And just in fairness, it seems like it would make sense to see what the building would look like at 6 stories. Because we haven't seen it. I think maybe in the first proposal we saw it, but in the proposal that we've all been kind of looking at most closely, we've not seen the renderings.
Let me ask city staff first. Do we have a rendering of 6 stories from Morningside in any of their proposals?
I'd have to look. I think most of them are the 4-story, and they just said it would just be a 2-story higher building. But I have to verify that with
I
Morningside.
have the stuff in front of me, but I don't know. Alderman Mulliner.
We have the massing for the 6-story. We do not have the actual renderings.
We have the what for the
The massing.
Okay.
There actually is a component in there that shows you what it would look like in mass, just block drawings of the 6-story.
Okay.
But we don't have the actual architectural.
Alderman York.
Thank you, Your Honor. I think, probably one of the first questions we want to do is ask Morningside, does this make sense to them before we go through the process of identifying all the numbers and everything? I mean, does it even make sense, and can they even get financing? And if the answer to those are no, it doesn't make any sense to invest the time to put the numbers together.
Let's tackle one question at a time. First question was, do we want to have city staff create an additional schedule, if you will? And if some aldermen want it, I see no reason not to. City staff said, I heard a couple of hours, so, create another schedule here, add a column here. The aldermen who want to, cross it out. But I would rather have more information than less. I don't disagree with the logic behind it, because I can do the math and say it's going to be worse. That helps me a lot in my decision making. But in this case, if city staff can pull together the information in an hour or two, and that's being requested, certainly I think that's something we can move forward with. Alderman Mulliner, Alderman Healy. Alderman, he waved it off.
Thank you, Mayor. So what I'm hearing is almost a paradox, that if the argument to get the numbers for the 4-story is because we want to see the difference between 4 and 6, I personally don't need the numbers to know that the numbers for the 4-story aren't going to be good. At least in my opinion, they're not going to be good. So to have them just to have them when I don't know exactly what they're saying, but I know they're going to not be good from a financial perspective. So if the discussion is about ROI and financials, to get staff to put together a piece of paper, I don't know that it makes a lot of sense, even if it only takes a couple hours. Now, if the discussion is there's a big difference between a 4-story building and a 6-story building, that one I understand, but to the point that was just addressed, we don't know, we can't conceptually look at that. So would be my opinion, if this council seriously is going to pursue or wants to think about pursuing a 4-story option, it's almost better we ask Morningside to come up with some rendering of what a 6-story would look like. Because I just think common sense is going to tell us the financials for 4-story aren't going to look very good. In my opinion, the financials between 5 and 6 don't look very good. They weigh pretty heavily right now, in my opinion. 4 stories just makes it worse. So if the conversation is financials, yes, let's get the schedule. If the conversation is the 2 stories difference, I think we need to see drawings.
Alderman Mulliner.
I'd like to make a motion that we put forward that we only compare the 5-story Morningside project and the 6-story Lincoln project.
So we have a motion on the floor and a second by Alderman York. So the motion is whether we move forward and compare just the larger of the 2 Morningside proposals with the 1 Lincoln proposal.
Correct.
Okay.
Point of order, can you do that?
Yes.
Can you do that in a committee of the whole meeting?
We can make decisions as a committee of the whole. We've done that in the past and followed Robert's rules to do so. So we can, the committee of the whole could have told me tonight that you don't want to have a meeting on the 27th and you want to vote tonight. That didn't happen. But we're going to make a decision on the committee of the whole 2 weeks from now. This is just another decision that the committee can make. So yeah, I feel it's appropriate. I'll check with.
I agree.
I think it's an appropriate motion to make. At this point, does the city, well, the motion stands. The motion is move forward with comparing the Lincoln proposal with the taller Morningside proposal.
We have it.
And there's a second by Alderman York. Discussion. Alderman Gutenkopf.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We have leapt to a decision-making based on financials without any serious discussion as a council about the other key components of the RFP that we put together as a group. There are aesthetic components, there are impact components, there are all kinds of pieces we will not be able to discuss. Should we move forward with this? We're asking for some simple financial analysis, it's really not that big a deal, so that when we meet at our next meeting to have the real substantive discussion about what we want this project to be, we will have some facts in front of us. We've got some renderings of a 4-story concept. Morningside put forward a 4-story concept as their primary as our primary idea, as the primary thing that they wanted to build down here. All I'm asking for is an opportunity for us to discuss, as part of this whole project, their primary proposal. Their alternative proposal was 6 stories. We've skipped over all conversation about their primary project in favor of an analysis that makes it look like we're comparing 2 similar things. If we move forward with this motion, I think we're doing the citizens of Elmhurst a great disservice. I think we're doing ourselves a great disservice. And I think we're taking a really big decision and cutting out a whole part of that conversation. I'm not really sure why so many people don't seem terribly interested in getting a little bit of additional information so that when we come back in 2 weeks, we can talk about it. Why would we skip this? What are you so worried about? It's really not that big a deal. What is a big deal is the fact that it seems like we're going to be making decisions about a project we haven't really seen. We're skipping over a whole bunch of conversation that we need to have about why we're deciding which project we want to move forward with, and I don't see what the point is. I think this is a big waste of time. We should just get the numbers, move on, and in 2 weeks we can talk about it.
Alderman Mulliner.
My point of moving this forward to discussing the 2 that seem to be more comparable to each other is just that. This is an opportunity, if anybody has concerns about wanting to look at the 4-story, for us to discuss that. It doesn't say that you can't discuss it right now. This is an opportunity for you to discuss that issue. It's right in front of you at this time. If there's concerns about it, that's what this body is about, and this body is about making decisions and moving a process forward. And we have that opportunity tonight to begin the process of moving this project forward, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Alderman Levin.
I understand what Alderman Gutenkopf is saying, and part of what I was trying to get at is, I guess, first of all, I'm not sure that the 4-story was the primary and the 6-story was the alternate. Maybe it was. I took it as they were wound up. Well, I understand how they started, but they wound up with supplemented financials that were refined on the 6-story, and I guess the first question I have for Assistant City Manager Kopp is, were the 4-story, was the original 4-story proposal refined as the 6-story one was? In other words, Lincoln gave some, after talking with Kane McKenna, came up, was part of the analysis for what costs were compared, and I saw that Morningside had adjusted its offer on the land on this on the 6-story. Did they also address and refine the 4-story?
No, we did not do that. We'd have to go back and verify all of that with the numbers. We have the base numbers they presented in original financials. We'd have to go back to make sure that like their financing, for instance, would they still be willing to change their financing to the format that they have presented for a 6-story. I don't know if that would be the case. We have to go back and verify those numbers. We have the base numbers from the 4-story concept. We don't have the refined numbers.
All right, and I guess as a follow-up, was there any discussion when you had with Lincoln, with Morningside, on the Morningside side, was there any discussion about the 4-story?
No.
Right, and the other question is, it seems to me that we're looking, I understand what Alderman Gutenkopf is saying is part of the discussion is, are we going to go above the 4-story matter of right building? But it seems like we're going to, if we look at the 6-story Lincoln and the 6-story Morningside and the 5-story Lincoln, we're selecting who we want to go to the dance with, and then the discussion of 4 stories or more is part of the discussion with whoever the successful applicant is, because that takes community input. So I guess my concern is if we're going to go back and ask Morningside to reanalyze stuff that it hasn't done yet to date, I think it's kind of a waste of time, but I'll look at it if that's what the council does.
Alderman Bram.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Quite honestly, I can't believe we're making a motion on a request for some simple additional information by one of the aldermen. I think that it would be premature to make any decision on that 4 stories is out of the question, just like anything. just like an equation. You balance one component of one side of the equation to the other side of the equation. Morningside has not withdrawn their original proposal, which was 4 stories. I think without even opening this binder, it's obvious that the 4-story was their initial proposal and the 6 was alternative, because we don't have additional renderings of the 6. They presented the 4-story. We went over the 4-story. Coming into tonight's meeting, we didn't have the information for the 4-story, the refined information for the 4-story option. If we had that, I would agree with Alderman Mulliner's comments that it would be appropriate to make a decision and move this forward. Let's not forget, this is a 100-year development. This isn't something that we're going to turn over and redo in 10 years. We have sat on this to some degree for a very, very long time, and some of us were on the council when this started. I don't think a simple request of additional refined financial information deserves a motion. It should just receive an acknowledgement of, yes, we will get that to you, and we will discuss and make that decision at the subsequent meeting. I will tell you that a 4-story option is one of the things that is attractive to me from the Morningside proposal. Lincoln clearly answered one of my questions, that they're not willing to go under their 5-story and exact number of units, give or take a few. So I think it is a necessity. I think it's utterly ridiculous that we're making a motion on a request of an alderman, and I cannot support this motion as it is.
Alderman Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll be honest, I got the numbers, the finances from the first go-round before this added information was given, and I dismissed a 4-story option at that point. The finances just don't make sense. They're not going to make sense. We could wish they can, we could hope they can, they're not going to. We've got $8 million tied up in that property. Alderman York mentioned it earlier. That doesn't count all of the lost money we've had and the taxing body the schools have had while that land is sat off the tax rolls. So that $8 million is actually higher than that. When you look at that and then take into consideration 5 and 6, we're barely breaking even on one and we're making money on the other. 4 stories doesn't help that. It makes it worse. So for me, for a while now, in my mind, 4 stories was never an option. So I agree with the motion, and it's nothing to do about, with option. To me, the numbers just can't get there to justify a 4-story option. I'm sorry, but that's the way I feel about it. And this council indicated that finances and economic impact was the #1 factor. It wasn't the only factor, and there were 6 or 7, but it was the #1 factor in terms of importance to us. If we're going to stick by that and believe it, 4 stories just isn't viable. Thank you.
Alderman Palomsky.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm looking at this as a matter of process, and I think that gathering additional information will not slow down our process. I think that we'll be in the same position the next time we gather with or without this information. I think it will just reinforce what we've already individually have come up with, and I think many of us are close to making a decision. So I don't think it'll hurt anything. I don't have a problem with gathering additional information.
I'm sorry, Alderman Palomsky, I hate to ask
Sorry,
you again,
no,
but I
know,
couldn't
I
hear
need
you.
to speak up. I don't have any problem gathering additional information. I don't think it'll slow down our process. I think it will only reinforce what many of us individually have already determined as we're coming close to making a decision. I don't see any problem in gathering more information. I just see it as part of the process. But I think many of us are close to making a decision without it. Thank you.
Alderman Dunn.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. We're in the midst of a proposal evaluation process. We had a lot more options several months ago. We've had 3 for a few months now, and I think what the motion is to continue the process of down selecting to move ahead after tonight with 2 viable proposals. And if the will of the council is that we think one is not viable and should not be continued to be evaluated and reviewed. It's a credible request. I don't view the motion as we don't want any more information on the 4-story. I'm interpreting it as we're ready to down select to 2 proposals. We're at 3 and we want to go forward with 2. That's the way I see it. Thanks.
Alderman Levin.
I welcome the opportunity to speak out of both sides of my mouth on this, but, you know, I really, when I made the suggestion, I thought it was going to be that that's why I wanted to know what the will of the council was. I thought we were all looking at the economics of it, but if it's an issue of the aesthetics, and if the aldermen who propose looking at the numbers feel that there's an argument to be made for a 4-story project, I don't have any problem looking at it. I was only trying to move it along, but I would be willing to look at it.
Any additional comments as it relates to the motion to eliminate 4-story from consideration of the council? And that's maybe something I should probably clarify. All of these decisions that we're making are certainly independent of the public review process and anything that would go before the Zoning and Planning Commission. We're certainly not making any assumptions or decisions on that behalf. The discussions about decisions being made are being made at the council level only. That having been said, do we have any more comments or questions as it relates to the motion at this point of the decision-making process to eliminate the 4-story Morningside proposal from further consideration and just stick with the original Lincoln and the larger Morningside proposal? Alderman Gutenkopf, you have additional comments.
One brief comment. I just want to remind the council that based on the weighted percentages of the 8 categories of the original RFP, a full 65% of our decision-making is other than economic impact and the applicant's financial capacity and experience. 65% of what we're supposed to be deciding is all of those other things. And I think they are all worthy of discussion, and I think we should give ourselves the opportunity to have that discussion in 2 weeks.
Okay. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll ask Clerk Spencer to call the roll on the motion before us.
Mulliner.
Aye.
York.
Aye.
Levin.
No.
Ely.
Aye.
Onquist.
No.
Kennedy.
No.
Wagner.
Aye.
Gutenkopf.
No.
Deuter.
No.
Dunn.
Aye.
Leader.
No.
Polumsky.
No.
Graham.
No.
Hipskin.
No.
All right, it looks like 1, 2, 3, 5 ayes and 9 nays.
5 ayes and 9 nays, that motion fails. I will ask city staff to prepare the additional schedule that looks like the first 2, and then add a column to the last schedule in that memo we got from Mr. Richlicki and Kane McKenna. Okay. Any other questions or comments, or any other questions or requests from city staff? We do have a standing request as it relates to an additional drawing out of Morningside for 6 stories. I'm wondering if that's possible. Is that an appropriate question for the council to ask? And is it possible? As I see it, and I'll relay this to the council, as I see it, we're asking one applicant for some additional information. We're not asking the other applicant for any additional information.
Point of order.
Yes, sir.
Do we have a legal opinion on whether we can do that? This was an RFP. It was a request for proposals, sealed bids, sealed RFPs. I don't know if they could do that.
Is it appropriate to ask for additional?
Sure.
I think we've asked for a lot of additional material from both RFPs, both people that have provided.
Both parties. This is not both parties.
But isn't there is there a rendering, I can't recall right now, is there a rendering for the 5-story from?
Yes.
If there is, it seems to me it ought to have a rendering, I mean, my own opinion is that we should have the rendering, and I think it's appropriate to ask for it.
I appreciate the question. I think legally it's appropriate to ask. And because it's a unique situation, we need specific information out of one applicant. Alderman Doyle.
Just to clarify, if we don't have to ask the developers to do any more work, I don't want to. And I know in the first proposal, I think there were some drawings of the 6-story. I know in the second document that we got with renderings, there are no drawings of the 6-story, I'm fairly certain. If there were some in the first one, if we can be referred back to that, that's okay with me. I just want, before we would consider a vote, I would want to see what it looks like.
Okay, let's do this. We'll just, city staff will request Morningside to supply additional information if possible within the 2-week time frame. We'll see what happens. Okay. Any other comments or questions that we want city staff to work on before? Okay, so as agreed earlier in the meeting, we are going to have a committee of the whole on the 27th, same as tonight after committee meetings. Okay? That having been said, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn. Motion to adjourn, Alderman York, second by Alderman Palomsky. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? We're adjourned. Thank you.